بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. سل إماما عاش في العلم دهورا ودهور، يطلب العلم ببذل حتى ضمته البحور. سل إماما عاش في العلم دهورا ودهور، يطلب العلم ببذل حتى ضمته البحور. صابرا في العلم صبرا حتى سموه الصبور، يخرج العلم بفأل مثل ريحان الزهور. صابرا في العلم صبرا حتى سموه الصبور، يخرج العلم بفأل مثل ريحان الزهور. واطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. كن إذا سموك اسما لتكن مثل الحضور، كن رفيقا كن عظيما كن كما تلك الصقور. كن إذا سموك اسما لتكن مثل الحضور، كن رفيقا كن عظيما كن كما تلك الصقور. راقيا بالعلم نحو النجم مزدان شكور، رافضا كل التدني رافضا نفس الغرور. واطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. ابن مسعود فقيه علم أحيا القفور، فإذا أعطاك رأيا كان سهما في النحور. ابن مسعود فقيه علم أحيا القفور، فإذا أعطاك رأيا كان سهما في النحور. وعلي ثم بالدين معاذ لا يبور، اقرأوا التاريخ تروي عنه أفواه سطور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. إن سألت عن إمام أو فقيه في الأمور، ابن عباس ترنم وسيبقى في الصدور. إن سألت عن إمام أو فقيه في الأمور، ابن عباس ترنم وسيبقى في الصدور. فهو كالشمعة تذهب حتى تأتينا بنور، ساهر بالليل علم وبأوقات سحور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور. إذ بكى النبي يوما سمعا صوتا جهور، يا أبي كم روت عنك الليالي والعصور. إذ بكى النبي يوما سمعا صوتا جهور، يا أبي كم روت عنك الليالي والعصور. أنتم اليوم كنبت قد علا فوق الجذور، يا أساس الدين يا صرحنا يا صلب الصخور. اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور، به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور.
الحمد لله رب العالمين، الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. As always, we welcome you back to Islamic Oasis Live. Brothers and sisters, as you know that we, every show that we bring in scholars, teachers, analysts, ulama from all different backgrounds, discussing the events that's affecting the Muslim world, whether they are local or whether they are international. All of you are aware of what's going on in Iran. If not, it's time to get to understand what's happening in Iran. Iran is in a very strategic location. A lot has taken place there since the last almost 150 years, if not throughout the Islamic history. But now we are all aware of the situation with Sister Amini, the sister that was taken in by the security or the police in Iran, and then she died while she was under police I guess, still in jail. The thing here is, of course, the whole situation is being played out as its issue regarding hijab. It's Islam, it's Muslims, it's the rules that are applied by Sharia, and it's the West is playing with this, the East is playing with this, but we as Muslims have to realize the realities and what is actually going on. And in order to discuss that, we have Sister Nazreen, or Dr. Nazreen. Is it Nazreen, sister, or is it Nasreen? I keep calling you Nasreen. I'm sorry. Is it Nazreen? It seems.
Either of the brothers, fine.
Okay. So we have Dr. Nazreen Nawaz. Let me give you a little bit background of the sister here. Dr. Nazreen Nawaz is director of women's section in Central Media Office of Hizb Tahrir, and a medical doctor by profession. She has lectured widely internationally, as well as authored various articles and booklets on women, Islam, and the Khilafah. She has also engaged in discussions with leading writers, journalists, academics, and politicians, and appeared on a number of media outlets to address attacks on women and Sharia, as well as issues related to Islam and the Khilafah. And also, we have Brother Adnan Khan. He was here before, and I'm sure some of you have visited his websites. I have gone many times after we've discussed what we have discussed to your website, Sheikh, and subhanAllah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your work. Brother Adnan Khan is a political analyst, author, activist, tax specialist, and founder of the Geopolity. He has written extensively on international issues for over 2 decades on areas such as economics, political Islam, energy, defense, and the Middle East. He has authored several books and is the author of Global Trends for the 21st Century and 100 Years of the Middle East. Welcome both of you to Islamic Oasis Live, brother and sister.
Jazakallah khair, brother.
So let's start. Dr. Nasreen, let's start with you on this issue. Obviously, it has become, is it the hijab? Is it about the hijab? So is it about the hijab, sister? What's going on in Iran?
Okay. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to all the viewers out there as well. So, brother, as in your introduction, the issues of what's happening in Iran is much more than just the death of Mahsa Amini. It's actually much more than the issues to do with enforcement of hijab or social system or Islam generally. So, what you see in Iran at the moment with the protests which are happening in various cities is actually the culmination of many years, if not decades, of growing anger amongst the general population of Iran towards a corrupt, towards an incompetent, and towards a brutal regime. So, for example, in Iran at the moment, you have quite a huge economic crisis going on in the country. You have, for example, inflation at 40%. You have the currency in Iran dropping to its lowest against the dollar. You have a situation where the GDP in the country has dropped by 70% since 2012. And this has caused huge economic strain upon the people, unbearable living conditions, high unemployment, skyrocketing costs of basic needs. And meanwhile, you have many of the political elite living quite affluent lives. So this has caused a lot of anger amongst the people. And alongside this, you have corruption, which is plaguing the regime as well. You have a number of kind of corruption cases which are going on in the country. So recently there was a $3 billion corruption case involving one of the steel companies within the country, which some of the insiders of the regime have been implicated in, have been accused of taking bribes from or being involved in various corrupt actions in relation to this steel company. So this has also caused anger amongst the people, and the complete wastage of the funds of the society on, incomprehensible wars like you see in Yemen, see in Iraq. So the wastage of finances, the economic mismanagement, and the mistreatment of minorities in the country as well, which we know has gone on for decades, whether it's the Kurds, whether it's the Arabs, the non-Persian ethnic minorities within the country, whether it's the people in the area of the Balochistan province and so on. So all of this has caused great anger amongst the people, and I think the death of Mahsa Amini in the hands of the morality police, whatever happened to her in that time, is basically being like a boiling point, a tipping point. But what's really important for us to understand is, like you mentioned in your introduction, is there are certain narratives which are being played out with these protests which are happening. And these narratives are not only coming internally from certain people who support certain liberal secular agendas within the country, but also externally. And that narrative is that it is Islam which is the problem here. It is Islamic governance, it is the hijab, it's the enforcement of hijab or the social laws which is the problem here. And I think it's really important for us to understand, like you say, like untwist or unwind the different kind of issues which are happening within the country to show that it is not about the hijab, it's about anger which is towards a brutal and incompetent and corrupt regime. And I think that's the kind of discussion that we need to understand. What is the cause of the oppression of the people? What is the cause of the misery, the economic problems of the people? It's this corrupt regime, a non-Islamic system, a system that has been supported by Western governments. I think that's the kind of debate that we need to have.
Okay, so sister, if just one more thing. So why the usage of hijab? I understand, of course, that they are trying to. We understand what's going on. It's much more than the hijab, but why is the concern that if they don't use hijab, or I guess let me ask you this: in Iran itself, what percent of the people would want really Islam, and so that they are trying to use again things like hijab in order so that people, if there is a real revolution in Iran, if really call for change happens in Iran, they don't go for Islam. Can this at least be a tactic?
Yeah. So, I mean, brother, the issue of hijab and Islamic social laws, the Islamic dress generally, this is always, actually for decades, if not a century or more, has been a tool that has been used by colonial powers and their supporters as a stick to beat Islam with. We know this for particular agendas. So back when, Lord Cromer, who was the general consul leader of Egypt, he was someone who generated this narrative that the veil, the Islamic dress, the Islamic social laws oppress women, and Muslim women need to be liberated from these social laws. And this was a man who was actually a founding member and one-time president of the Men's League back in Britain, which was actually opposed the suffragette movement. So you can see that his so-called concern for Muslim women was not genuine. It was not something which was sincere. It was purely bred from this idea of trying to justify colonization in the Muslim world, the name of, liberating certain people, liberating the Muslims, saving Muslim women, trying to justify their presence and their colonizations of the Muslim world. And this narrative that Islam oppresses women, that hijab oppresses women, has been recycled over generations and continues to be replicated in other voices today amongst various secular media, liberal media, and also Western governments and those who support them within the Muslim lands, including Iran, in order to demonize Islam and in order to basically prevent any return of Islamic governance and to push a secular agenda amongst the people, to justify a secular future for that land. And we see Afghanistan as well, right? The use of women's rights, the use of Muslim women and their rights, and Islam and, the burqa and all of this stick as a stick to beat Islam with, to basically justify a secular program within these countries. So this is not something new. This is something which is a long record of being used in order to push colonial agendas in our Muslim lands. In terms of what the people of Iran want, there are many different polls that have come out, actually. There's an interesting one, actually, a few years ago by Pew. Pew, one of the international poll agencies, and they actually found around 80% of people in Iran, they wanted Islam. Yeah, so in terms of what kind of Islam, we can have a discussion regarding that. But in terms of the polls that have been done of the Muslim lands in general, you can see large proportions, like 70 to 90%. These are polls done by Gallup, done by Pew, that show Muslims wanting the Sharia, wanting Islam to be the official law of the land. So there's a kind of there's kind of distance between what is being promoted, that Muslim women want liberation from Islam, and the kind of, scenes that you see. I'm not saying that some women, of course, they want a liberal kind of future. They may not want to wear hijab. Of course, that's the reality. This idea that's being pushed, which is that the masses reject Islam. The masses reject the Islamic dress. The masses reject the Sharia of women. This is something which is not true. And this is something that needs to be countered by us as Muslims.
That is very true. Something that I observed myself in Kabul, for instance, what we see, this whole discussion of women around the streets of Kabul and they're protesting. That's the only thing that you see is in Kabul and maybe on a small street that used to be under the so-called green zone. Of course, there's no more green zone, but 90% of Afghanistan, you cannot go and tell the woman to remove the hijab. You will cause bloodshed if you're going to ask people and the women of Afghanistan to remove hijab. These are tribal people. They will not let you live. So I understand what I was seeing on the TV before I got on the ground and what I observed on the ground. I mean, it's a whole two different ballgame, which I understand. Brother Adnan, how Islamic was the so-called Islamic revolution of Iran? And the reason I'm asking you this is, of course, it's this whole thing about hijab and is being presented as Islamic problem and the Muslims and kada. We know that even the revolution, when it happened, there were communists involved. There were people who wanted democracy involved. There was many different ideological people or groups involved in bringing Khomeini to power. And then he comes in power and he does what he does. What do we know about this whole situation, Akhi? And why was it presented as Islamic revolution?
So the revolution that took place in 1979, it took place because everyone had enough of the Shah. The Shah had turned into a brutal dictator, and literally his Western reforms and his economic policies were running the country into the ground. So you find throughout the 60s, opposition began to grow. And really by the mid to late 70s, you find that widespread discontent really went deep in Iranian society. So what you find, many different elements of Iranian society came together to overthrow the regime. As you mentioned, you had the communists, you had socialists, you had nationalists, and you had the clerics as well, who have always held a position within the country. Now, many clerics in Iran, long-term clerics who were critical of the Shah, they had either gone into exile or been kicked out of the country anyway. And this is how Ayatollah Khomeini was in Iraq until he was thrown out of Iraq and he ended up in France. So you find the only thing that united these people was we want the regime overthrown. We want the Shah overthrown. And that's really the end of their unity. So you find Islamic slogans were just one of many slogans at the time. That's why you'll find today many Iranians, they're quite old. They took part in the revolution. And they will say this. They will say, we didn't support the clerical regime. We didn't support Islamic rule. We wanted the regime gone. And then they all had their ideas of what should happen after as well. What ended up happening, as we know, is the clerical regime, after the army, the clerical regime the clerics were probably the strongest faction in the country. And we know that in France, where Ayatollah Khomeini was, everybody was going to meet him there. The Americans, the British, the French, everybody was meeting him. So it wasn't he just came out the blue and he got to power. It was very clear to the Americans that the clerics are probably the strongest faction and they can bring a degree of stability. There's always been a lefty communist movement in India. There's always been a worry the leftists could take over. This actually goes back to Muhammad Mossadegh, even before the Shah. This has always been a threat. And this has always been used that if the rest of the country don't unite, the communists or the lefties are going to take over. But what we find is where you had the rule of a monarch, we then transitioned very quickly to the rule of a clerical regime. And even Ayatollah Khomeini, you could argue, was quite a strong singular leader over everybody else. But one of the first things he did when he got to power is he looked at who his threats were. And his threats were everyone that got him into power. It was all the communists, it was the students, and all these people. So he either killed them or one by one, they all went into exile. And then they all live abroad. They give consultancy about Iran. They tell the CIA and the intelligence agencies what's going on. So that's how things evolved in the end. So that's why today, I think over 70% of Iran's population is under 40, so they were born after the revolution.
Mm.
So the justification, the narrative the clerical regime have is things were so bad under the Shah, we overthrew him, so we are your saviors. And they've been using this narrative for decades. And we've got to a point now where people who were not born around the revolution, their view is these 70, 80, 90-year-olds run the country, they run it into the ground, and they're talking about an era before we were born, and that's why they should stay in power. But you've got a 4-decade track record of the clerical regime. Look at the economy, look at Iran's foreign relations, look at the state of the situation of most people. This is a country that has the largest gas well in the world. It has some of the largest oil and gas in the world. It shouldn't really be in this scenario. So it's funny, in a country where the regime is very anti-American, you've got a lot of pro-American support within this country. And a lot of people do this because they just had enough of the regime. And you find the situation in Iran is quite similar to the wider Muslim world, where regime dictatorial rulers have run the country in the ground. They use the iron grip to remain in power. And then naturally, you're going to get a clash between the masses and the rulers. And Iran is just the current case study of this.
So, Dr. Nazreen, here's the thing. Most of the revolutions in the Muslim world so far, whatever happened, as far as the Arab Spring, and most of them in many ways were leaderless revolutions. There was no, if there was any leadership, I remember in Syria, I don't know if you guys remember 2019, I think it was 2017, when 49 brothers were killed at one time. They were taken out by a Syrian attack by, I think it was the Russians or the Americans, not sure. Most of the leadership of every group was taken out. And after that, there was no leadership, and we see where Syria is today. We see where Libya is today. We see where Egypt is today. So in Iran, let's see, sister, is there, let's say if there is a revolution, can it succeed without any serious leadership and without a clear ideological objective?
I think that's a really important question, brother, because the thing is that absolutely there should be huge anger towards the regime and towards the decades in terms of how it's oppressed the people and in terms of how it's run the country run the land to the ground. But what we need to look at is what kind of change is required within Iran and the Muslim lands generally in order to create a better future for the people, a more stable, economically prosperous region. What is required for that? What kind of revolution is required for that? And it's really important that we learn from the past as well, because the worst thing is recycling failure. Going and doing the same thing again and again in different countries and expecting different results. Actually, that's one of the, they say that's one of the signs of madness, trying the same thing and expecting different results at the end of it. So, for example, if you see what's happened to Tunisia and Egypt as an example, the Arab Spring, people had many hopes of getting rid of dictatorships, whether it's Mubarak or whether it's Ben Ali, and hopes of building a better future for themselves. But what do we see in Tunisia at the moment? Again, you see a massive economic crisis in Tunisia at the moment. You see, for example, that debt has basically doubled since the start of the Arab uprising, so 2011 till 2022. In fact, they say that the amount of debt to GDP is 80% in the country. It's proposed to reach 100% by 2025. So you have a huge economic problem in Tunisia. You have political problems and crises, within Tunisia. And you have, again, massive problems with unemployment and people, skyrocketing prices of basic needs. And similarly in Egypt as well. So we saw, kind of democratic elections. You have the Muslim Brotherhood coming into power, and then you have like a dictatorship taking over. And now, again, you have in Egypt dictatorship and a massive economic problem. 30% of the people in Egypt are said to be underneath the poverty line. You have people struggling to make basic needs. So we need to learn from, what happened in our lands. And you see this replicated across the Muslim world. You have, whether it's dictatorships or whether it's, so-called secular democracies like we see in Turkey, or whether we see monarchies or theocracies, all of these kind of systems failing. So what we as Muslims need to realize from this, rationally, you can see that any man-made system is bound to fail. Whether it's a theocracy, whether it's democracy, dictatorship, monarchy, it is bound to fail. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us this in the Quran clearly. Whoever does not rule by what Allah has revealed, they are the oppressors. Yeah. So in terms of leadership, sister, brother, what we need to look at is what kind of leadership can actually provide a sound vision for how to solve the problems of the region, whether it's Iran or any of the Muslim lands. And I would propose that that vision can only come from the one who made us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that vision cannot be a few basic principles here and there. It needs to have concrete principles, concrete laws, and concrete systems, and a blueprint really of how to solve the political, economic, social, educational, all the kind of problems that people are going through at the moment. And I would propose that the Islamic system of governance, which is the Khilafah system, the system that provides that time-tested vision for how you actually solve the practical problems that people are going through in the region. That's the kind of leadership that is required. You can't achieve that by just forcing people to accept, certain rules. You need to build a ground base of support for those ideas. And this is where the dawah for Islam and changing the ideas of the people comes in, to change their ideas, break the non-Islamic ideas that they have, and to build the support for Islam and Islamic governance.
So, Sheikh, Jazakallah khair for this. Brother Adnan, well, you have Taliban next to Iran. I mean, from what the sister said, there is. How do you think Taliban are perceived in Iran? And as far as with the tensions in the region, like for instance, I'll give you an example. When I was in Kabul, there was a lot of discussions taking place of what's happening in Iran, because obviously it's next door. So there is that video going around of brothers with turbans that are there, and youth are running around removing the turbans and stuff like this. This whole situation going on in Mashhad and Tehran and Shiraz and all this. So I asked the brothers in Afghanistan, I said, if this education situation with the sisters in Afghanistan, I mean, we can talk about what's really happening, but if this kind of Islam is spread in Afghanistan, do you also see something like this happening in Afghanistan? And the answer was, the Muslims of Afghanistan will never do what those people are doing in against Islam, let's say, against the hijab and against such and such. But at the same time, they don't see a clear vision from Taliban. Why does this happen? I mean, Taliban they're supposedly a bunch of tulab al-ilm. And being tulab al-ilm, they cannot provide a vision. They don't know how to teach 11, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old girls. What's the deal here, Sheikh? The sister is saying that, look, you have to have a vision, clear vision, and she's obviously proposing the Khilafah. On the other hand, you have people who are consider themselves to be very knowledgeable people who have taken power, and they don't know how to set up a simple school for girls. What's missing, Sheikh? Why do we get into this mess all the time?
So you've got a couple of things, really, when we look at the Taliban. Firstly, look, Afghanistan is a country that's basically been at war for the past 40, 50 years.
Yes.
They're at war before the Soviet invasion. The Soviets invaded. They defeated the Soviets, and they had their own civil war. Then eventually the Americans invaded, and they were there for about 20 years until they left last summer. So for the best part of 40, 50 years, this country's been at continuous war. Yeah. So these aren't the sort of scenarios you've got time to sit, have a think about your vision, lay out principles, lay out a clear strategy of how you're going to get there. Then I think we've got to keep in mind that Taliban, as you mentioned, they were students. They have an understanding of Islam, which is fine, which is necessary. However, you also need to understand other things like, modern economics and international relations and how you navigate that. Now, obviously, they've been at war for 40 years, so they've not really had a chance to really do that. So now they're in power. So, their understanding is, do you have a bed? Are you praying? And, can you see the sister's hair? Rather than How do we utilize our resources in the country? How do we build infrastructure? How do we reunify and reach out to the wider Muslim world? So it's interesting. This time round, they're putting out a lot more that we're not going to make the mistakes of the 1990s. So in 1990, there was their way or the highway. That was it. Also, I think there's a bit more internal division amongst them. And you're seeing that with the issue of the schools for secondary school girls. You've got the government in Kabul who are really trying to get international legitimacy, who are really trying to show an image of moderation. And then you've got the Taliban support base from the south of the country who are
Kandahar.
quite horrified what they're seeing sometimes from Kabul and these sort of things. And even this decision to not allow secondary school girls go to school, that was a decision that was a U-turn right at the end, literally a couple of days before school was supposed to reopen.
And supposedly it's supposed to be just top 3 clerics on the top that are against this. It's not the general consensus, by the way, amongst the Taliban not to open the schools. It's literally the top 3 people on the top.
So this is the problem they got. So this is why you find, this is a group that hasn't had a sit down and laid out, their grand vision. That's why if you find from the Taliban, they've never spoken about issues beyond their borders. They don't speak about the region. They don't speak beyond that. Obviously, they've been at war. They've been invaded. So a lot of their thinking and actions have been, how do we repel the enemy? How do we defeat the enemy? How do we bleed them to death? So in that sense, that goes in their favor. They're not like the Muslim Brotherhood have been at this work for 80 years. They're probably the oldest group around today. And when they got to power, unfortunately, there was no blueprint. There was no grand plan. I mean,
that's what I'm asking. Look. Okay, forget. Let's put out. That's also Dr. Nazreen, you too. I mean, you can anytime get in here. And with so many, look, I was talking to one of the scholars here, and he was telling me, look, our problem is so many. Allah Subhanahu wa Taala has given us so many, events that are taking place that are actually in our favor. There's so much going on, but we are not able to capitalize on the. So what is it? What's the reason behind that, brother and sister? This is to any one of you, and both of you can answer that.
So, I mean, when you're declined and disunited as a people, this is what happens. You can't marshal your resources. Opportunities present themselves. You can't take advantage of them. In fact, we're seeing countries that are weaker than 2 billion Muslims who can take advantage of them. So remember, this was the scenario when our Prophet ﷺ came. What was the state of the Quraysh? What was the state of the Arabs? Very disunited, used to go to war over silly things. And then it was our Prophet ﷺ who united them. And remember, when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, only the Arabian Peninsula was under Islam. It was after the Prophet where, it spread to lands we're from. Islam spread well beyond the Arab lands. So unfortunately, what we find today is you do find Muslims who have vision, but unfortunately, sometimes it's the wrong vision. You have other Muslims who are very pious, but they don't necessarily have a vision for Islam and the global ummah. And then some you have who do engage in Islamic activities. However, they lack how do we present Islam and how do we physically implement it in the modern age. So the problem is clearly internal. We've got external issues, foreign interference and stuff like that. The problem, however, I would still say the Muslims are going in the right direction compared to 3-4 decades ago, where people were invested in some of the Muslim rulers, where people are invested in a EU type model for the Muslim world. Now what you're seeing is, people want the regimes gone. We had the Arab Spring over a decade ago. It's very clear that the regime needs to go and we need to replace it with something different. And all the surveys show that Muslims want Islam to play a very central role in what comes after these regimes. So really now it's about getting rid of the architecture that's in the way, removing it, and then implementing what we physically believe in. That's the direction we need to go. This is very clear for a lot of people. For a lot of people, how will that work in the modern age? How will that work in the global world? How will that work in the international system we got? That we can discuss. But it's interesting because from Western think tanks and Western countries themselves, their view is again and again that the Muslim world wants Islam to play a central role in governance, in legislation, in their lives. So that's what they're saying. Right? And obviously they're monitoring these particular regions. So really it's for us to remove these final obstacles. And these obstacles are some of the rulers. some of these elites and some of these people infatuated by the West. The Arab Spring, you could say, was the 1.0. It's not finished yet. In fact, I think in many of the Arab world, the situation is far worse now than it was over a decade ago. So I think the Arab Spring was starting the process, the beginning of the process, not the end.
So Dr. Nazreen, anything on your...
What I was going to say, brother, is I think today there's a disconnect between the Islamic knowledge that people gain within schools, madrasas, and between, even universities about Islam. So there's a knowledge about Islamic history, about the concept of even Islamic political system, about Islamic economics. There's knowledge out there, but I think the disconnect is between this knowledge and how do you apply it in reality? How do you actually apply it to solve the real problems that the Ummah is going through and that mankind is going through, basically, the world is going through. And one of the reasons for that is, I think, the concept of pragmatism. The concept of pragmatism is just kind of doing things according to the status quo. I think, unfortunately, that's still quite strong amongst Muslims, that the idea that we cannot change things radically, that we need to deal with institutions within our reality. So, for example, we have an economic problem, we need to go to the IMF. We have a genocide that's going on, we need to go to the United Nations to solve these issues. So instead of understanding that the only practical way to solve our problems as Muslims is actually the implementation of the system of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we need to bring that connection between the knowledge that we gain as Muslims when we study Islam and all the, even the history books of Islam, to understand that that was a model in place, isn't it? When we talk about the Caliphate, it was a model in place that implemented the system of Islam. We need to bring that connection between what we gain, the knowledge of Islam that we gain, and how do we use this in order to solve our problems as an ummah. And I think that's also one of the kind of reasons of why, like you mentioned, you have students of Islam, but yet the problems are not solved according to Islam. Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons of why, we're in the position that we are today.
The disconnect. No, that's very true. I'm going to go to a little bit of this different section here. Here's the thing. So you have, in many ways, the proxy wars that are taking place in this region. Well, let's talk about just the tensions in this region. You have Pakistan on the verge of a complete collapse, right? I mean, then you have Taliban, a whole different phenomenon taking place, right in the middle of, and then you have Iran, and then you have Russia, you have China, you have. What are you guys seeing when you are looking at this region from afar? I mean, are you seeing that can the US use this region for its own proxy wars that it already is doing, using Ukraine, for instance, for what it wants to do in Russia or with China? Or what do you see as far as Pakistan situation with Taliban and with Iran? I mean, because could Pakistan be used for a proxy war situation in Iran? What do you guys see? I guess I'm just so, the region is so ripe for change. How would you capitalize on this thing?
So if you look at this region, you're right, it's always been very important. So up until the 1990s, obviously the Cold War defined this region. So you were either supporting the Soviet Union or you were supporting America. So, Pakistan, Iran, all these countries were on one side with America against the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, you find a decade later, America went into Iraq and Afghanistan, and it cajoled and forced countries who either wanted or didn't want to join them in the war on terror. Now what you're seeing is going forward is the issue of China. So these countries in the region, in South Asia, in Central Asia, they're going to have to make a decision. And already what you're seeing is things are starting to fall into place. You've got this alliance structure America setting up with Europe, with the Middle East. Obviously, China is trying to use the economic card to ensure no bloc emerges against it. But going forward, what you're really going to have is you're going to have to make a choice. Are you on the Chinese side or are you on the American side? And the challenge China has is, America's been involved in South Asia, the Middle East since World War II. It has deep relations. Its hands go very deep into these countries. China just doesn't have that level of influence. However, it has the economic card, which it's going to use. So this is where, countries like Pakistan, countries like Iran, what they're going to be looking at is, are you going to look at your own interests or will you be joining the interests of another power? They've done that in the past. Pakistan joined America in the Cold War. What did it get out of it? Pakistani politicians keep saying that Pakistan's lost 30, 40 billion in terms of GDP by joining America's war on terror. Well, anybody will tell them, no, that was a really bad investment. But they've done that. They did that then. They did that when the Soviet Union invaded. So the problem you've really got here with our rulers is, are you going to find a third way, which is the interests of your people, the Muslims, or will you really just fall into one of two camps? And unfortunately, our countries have always done that. Rather than developing an independent path, which they can, the fact that America needs Pakistan for Afghanistan, the fact that America needs to work with Iran, whether it's being anti-Iran or pro-Iran, shows you the importance. The fact that they need to work with Saudi shows you that these countries are means for foreign countries to achieve their goals, which that will tell you straight away that these countries are really key. They're really strategic. Unfortunately, what we have is the rule of these countries have no problem putting out services to foreign countries rather than to their own people. That's a scenario that you've actually got here. And also, I mean, you just had the midterms in America, and American society is very polarized. That's going to have an impact eventually on America's global position. So if some of our rulers are expecting America's going to come and save them if things get a bit unstable, America's got bigger priorities at home coming up. So, these are the sort of opportunities we're facing going forward. I mean, when America invaded Afghanistan, nobody would have thought within a decade or two America will be in this scenario. This represents quite a unique opportunity for us. America can't save and shape every global issue. It's got too many problems at home now.
It does. But see, the problem with the American, well, not the problem. What's going for the Americans, Sheikh, is whether I mean, of course, we can discuss whether capitalism is failing, and we understand it's a failing ideology, but they have an ideology, and they are. The problem with us is that we're not with anything. And only thing that's happening is that we are being utilized. So that's the opportunity issue, right? Again, there is an opportunity. You have a superpower it's in decay, but we can't use this as an opportunity. Dr. Nazreen, here's the thing. How much, like you were talking about, look, we need to seriously look into the Khilafah and study it, and the Muslim youth, or at least the ulama or the tulab al-ilm, there is a disconnect. Let me ask you this. I mean, if someone to come and ask, are you serious? Do you want Khilafah in Iran and the whole Shia Sunni issue? How would you, I mean, are we saying we want Khilafah in Iran? That's a question, I know, but I'm asking you because, a lot of people will ask that question, and they'll say, oh, what are we doing here? I mean, the kind of questions that are asked, rather than... Absolutely. Go ahead. I might have put you on a situation, but...
No, not at all, brother. I think the debate that needs to be had at the moment in terms of the political events which are happening in Iran is what kind of system and leadership should replace what's there at the moment. I think we're all in agreement that the regime in Iran cannot continue. It's a brutal regime. The people want it removed. It's failed to provide their basic needs. It's failed to implement Islam in any ways. I mean, this idea that this regime represents Islam is farcical. It's a regime that, as we know, has aided Assad to murder thousands of Muslims. It's a regime that's had its hand in the killing of Muslims in Iraq and in Yemen. It's a regime that is shaking hands with the Hindutva regime in India, basically.
I mean, just signed a deal with Israel in the name of with the Lebanon situation, and literally signed. The deal that they have made for gas would not happen without without Iran.
Right. So what we yeah. So the point that we need to understand is that there needs to be a change in Iran, as there needs to be a change in all of the Muslim lands that we discussed. Like there's crisis after crisis across the Muslim lands. So the discussion and debate that we need to have is what kind of system can replace what we have in the Muslim world at the moment, whether it's Iran or the other Muslim lands. So what's happening in Iran is there's a narrative again that's being pushed, is that if we have a real democracy, if we have a secular liberal system, then you will have rights for women protected, you will have good economic prospects, you will have political stability. This is what is being pushed by the opposition and by various factors within Iran. So now what we need to do as Muslims is we need to really analyze that narrative. So when you ask me the question, will the Khilafah, is that what we want for Iran? Let's take a step back and understand, first of all, what are the proposed solutions, the alternative solutions that are being put forward for Iran? Okay, so will a secular liberal democracy actually bring a better system and a better way of life and a standard of living for the people of Iran? Now, for us living in the West, we have first-hand experience of what a secular liberal democracy brings to people. Here in Britain, we know there's a massive economic crisis. You have a situation where people are having to choose between eating or freezing to death because they can't afford their energy bills. You have a situation where like problems of social breakdown, a tsunami of family breakdown, of depression amongst the youth. You have huge problems in terms of women. The demonstrations in Iran were over the death of one woman, Mahsa Amini. I mean, they were triggered initially by the death of one woman, Mahsa Amini. But in the US, as you know, brother, you have 3 women who are killed every day at the hands of domestic violence, right? So what we need to first of all look at and break down in discussions with, the Muslims in Iran, whether Shia or Sunni, is you're calling for this system. You feel that this secular liberal system, a democratic system, will provide for you a brighter future. Then show me the proof of that. Show me the proof of how it has worked in any state in the world, West or East. Show me that. And once we have that debate, then we can move on to what kind of system that we are proposing for Muslims and for non-Muslims in the world, And the Khilafah, we saw historically, was a system that was able to bring together. I mean, for example, Iraq as an example, you have Shias and Sunnis living in Iraq, right, side by side, getting married, praying in the same mosques. It was underneath Islamic rule that happened. So if anything, it is only Islamic rule and a leadership that understands how to unite the Muslims, regardless of their variances of difference of opinion or madhabs or whatever. It's the Islamic rule that can unite Muslims. Whereas secular systems actually create and strengthen the divisions between Muslims. And we know the West plays on those divisions. We see that, right? So let's have the debate, first of all, of what kind of solutions are being put forward as an alternative to the regime in Iran. And then let's have that debate in terms of why we see Islamic rule as the only unifying system that can bring people of different madhabs and Islamic, viewpoints together, and a means to fulfill the needs and the rights of all as citizens of the state, inshallah.
No, that's a very interesting point. So what you are saying is that, look, the other alternatives are capitalism, communism. Is that those are the only other alternatives? Either it's Islam.
I mean, yeah. Well, the thing is what you see in the discussions happening is mainly the opposition calling for a secular, liberal, democratic future, isn't it, for Iran?
No, I'm saying even amongst the, let's say the religious class, whatever that means. Yeah. For them, whenever you discuss this issue, you have the Shia-Sunni issue comes up and said, oh, you guys are, you want to even call them and they are Shia and such and such. But I guess, is that brother Adnan, even here, is there an intellectual gap, Sheikh, amongst the Muslims? Is there a gap here that we don't see? We are willing to live under capitalism and communism, but they don't want the Khilafah system for humanity, but they don't mind living under communism and capitalism for humanity. Is there an intellectual gap, Sheikh? Is there it's weird that for Muslims we say these things.
So look, sometimes unfortunately what you get a scenario where if you present anything which is beyond the current circumstance, current global system, people just don't see it practical. How will it work? So you find even the most Islamic Syrian rebel group, when a camera was in front of their face, do you want Islamic State? They couldn't. They would say, no, we want a civil state. They weren't confident enough to actually do that. The other thing is, we've got this model, unfortunately, the clerical regime in Iran and the monarchy in Saudi, they pushed that both have these unique models, these sectarian models, and they can't coexist with each other. And that's why there's this competition. So in Iran, they've had a sectarian state for 40 years. Look at what it's done. Yeah. So if they want to continue, like if the argument is that, these people are unique, and again, the Iranian people aren't unique. Their problems are the same as the wider Muslim world. The issues are the same as the wider Muslim world. You've got regimes who don't have your interests at heart, and for them, it's all about regime survival. This Shia model, this sectarian state they've got, it only serves the clerical regime. It doesn't serve anybody else in the country. The fact that the economy has been run to the ground clearly shows you it doesn't work for the people. So when people look at Iran, they would just say, well, because they're Shia, then they must have something Shia related. That's not the case. The people want their regime gone, despite the fact that it's a sectarian regime that tries to claim legitimacy that they're legitimate rulers. The fact that people are on the streets now, people were on the streets when COVID happened, they used the lockdown to stop them.
That should be an opportunity for Sunni Islam to take over.
Well, we don't really necessarily need to see it. In fact, we're a lot more united. They want Islam, their deen, they believe, to play a central role in their lives, in society, in their laws. That's what we want as well. There's actually a lot more that unites us. The politics, where there's a bit of disunity, but that's not because of the people. That's because of the Saud family, the Gulf leaders, and the clerical regime. It's not amongst the people.
No, this is,
they need to do that to show that this, what the clerical regime will do is only we can take care of you because you're Shia, you have a particular faith, you can't trust the other people. And that suits them because that's what keeps them in power. That's exactly what the Sauds do, it's what the other Gulf leaders do. In fact, every nation state we've got, Muslim nation state, that's what they do. That only we can take care of you. And what does that do? That disunites you even more. But interestingly, in most of our countries, people have had enough of their regimes and they want them gone. I mean, you went to Afghanistan, that border, the Durand line, for most people doesn't exist.
No, it doesn't exist.
It literally doesn't exist. The people who live there don't exist.
Actually, I'll tell you the funny part was when I was on the Tajikistan border, the people were telling me, just the average Afghani, the brothers Muslims were telling me that, if the Muslims here wanted to unite, you could take Tajikistan in one day. Literally, we could take it in one day. But the funny part was they said that, look, I mean, if you look across the border, you have the Amu Darya, which is the Amu River, the famous Amu River that goes all the way up to Kashmir. The border is being protected by the Russian army. And it was funny that I was asking a question. I said, I don't know if you saw the video I made. I said, it's funny that you have, if the Muslims wanted to be divided, you would think that, okay, you would have a Muslim army on the other side protecting the borders so the Muslims don't come together. But it's the Russians who are there, and every 200 yards there's a Russian post that is making sure that somehow this unity does not take place. And the only thing that's there that really is dividing is, if not this Russian army, but it's the Amu Darya. That's it. And it's a joke, akhi, yani, subhanallah. Here's a question for both of you, whoever wants to take this. Look, in Saudi, you have this, whole thing of kibarul ulama. I guess I'm just saying this all falling apart now? You had the kibarul ulama, which now we see how, I guess they have become Halloween puppets. I'm not sure how to put it together. And then you have Wilayatul Faqih in Iran. Then you have, these Azhar graduates in Egypt. And then you have these Deobandi clerics that you see in India who are keeping the people as quiet as possible just to keep. I mean, are they falling apart? Is it's yani, in every so-called these areas, these were the groups, I guess, elite ulama groups that were put together to control the masses. Are we seeing them falling apart?
So what we're seeing is the Ummah's
But at the same time, we need the ulama. Just to, but we need the ulama. But now they are being. So go ahead.
Yeah. So what you've got is, obviously we've had a lot happen in the Muslim world, and we've had a lot happen with the Muslims for the last 20, 30 years. That has led to a lot of rethinking. That's led to a lot of things becoming a lot more clear. Things have become a lot more clearer: who are our real allies, who are not our real allies, who really has the Muslim interest at heart and who doesn't. So what a lot of these groups are finding is they're over here and the sentiments of the Ummah are completely somewhere else. You had ulama in Saudi saying that protesting against the regime is haram, but it's perfectly okay for Muslims to protest against the regime in Syria. So these contradictions are becoming a lot more clearer now. I mean, for years, the ulama justified the Saudi regime. They're building a mosque and all that. Now, I mean, how do you? So the Ummah's understanding has got better. Things have become a lot more clearer. So many of these groups who were, mainstream groups are finding it a struggle now. Look at groups like Hamas, Hezbollah.
Yeah.
Syria happened. You had to take a position. You couldn't sit on the sidelines, and that's actually exposed a lot more people. It's exposed a lot more ulama. So now you're finding our regimes have to go even further to maintain their grip on power. But what do you do when the masses rise up? What does Sisi do if the masses take to the streets again? What do the clerical regime do if the people take to the streets again? If it spreads to the security state, they're going to have a massive problem. So they're going to do everything they can to make sure it doesn't get there. But the reality is the Ummah is a lot more clearer about things. They've clearly seen who supports the West, who doesn't, who has Muslim interests at heart. And that's why you're now finding is that the ulama that are sincere, the ulama that took the right path, they're loved by the Ummah. Whilst groups who were really, really popular at one time, you're finding that a lot of them have either lost their credibility or they've just gone into the oblivion now because they have very little credibility. So what that shows you, the Ummah is going in the right direction. A lot of things have happened which have exposed those who are using Islam just for a means to an end. I mean, if you take the example of Syria, take Syria and Afghanistan. The Muslims of Afghanistan, the Taliban, fought the enemy. The people in Afghanistan who sided with the enemy. In Syria, the people fought the regime. They're still technically fighting the regime. So now it's clear who are your real enemies and who are your allies. So it should be clear to everybody now that all the rebel groups that were supported by the regional nations, none of them provided or gave any support that would make a difference. They never gave the arms or the equipment that would make a difference. And we have a 10-year track record to really show you that. So unfortunately with the ulama, what you've got is obviously, as you mentioned, some of these groups really emerged in order to take away some of the demand for change from the people. And, some of these groups were pushed really to take the Ummah down a path which didn't require fundamental change in any particular country. Just, a few faces change and stuff like that. However, in the Arab world, they've gone through one wave of uprising. So in Egypt, hopefully now they've realized that, removing one person ain't going to make a difference. You're going to have to remove the whole system. And sometimes these things take time, but, we're talking about this now. Our rulers, they're going to worry. Their populations are increasing. They're going to provide for them economically. There's no long-term plan. And they want to maintain their thrones as well. The Saud family have got a throne to maintain. So really the odds are against them. At the end of the day, at some point, the Ummah will get it right. At some point, change will succeed. They've got to make sure change never succeeds. They're going to make sure the Ummah always fails. So if you think about it, they're really on the back foot. It's not the Ummah. Yeah, we may be talking, when will change come? How will it come? Victory's been promised and eventually will happen. Their problem is if the Ummah succeeds once, that's the end of their thrones. That's the end of the status quo for them.
Sister, Dr. Nasreen, if you can answer this also, but I have a very important question on that regarding the role of women also for you, especially in, no matter what, women have always, like you said in the beginning of this conversation, that look, it's always the woman. If they can't find anything else to talk about in Islamic law, which they always bring up the woman. So it seems that the sisters actually play maybe even more important role in the change that's coming. So what do you think, sister? What should the sisters be doing? What should be the sisters of this ummah be doing for preparation? Preparing their sons, their daughters, their husbands, the men of the ummah today. What is their role, and how should they be preparing them?
Absolutely. So, rather like you say, that the woman has also always been a target for the colonial West, and they understood that the woman is the center of the family. So she's the nurturer of future generations. She's the heart of the community, and therefore she's always been a target. So the thing is, as women, we therefore need to use our key position as the center of families, as the nurturer of generations, as the heart of communities, to inshallah play a vital role in creating change amongst the ummah. But to create change amongst the ummah, we first need to understand what creates that clear change, because if not, then we'll be misguided to actions and goals which will not achieve our vision. So Brother Adnan talked about the fact that, and yourself talked about the fact that the regimes today in Iran, in Saudi, are falling apart. Now, the thing is, it's really crucial for us as Muslims to understand what kind of system actually represents an Islamic leadership. Because if we don't, then we'll make the same mistakes again and again. We will just fall for the same trap of, okay, this has a tinge of Islam. This has a few Islamic laws being implemented. This is a leader who talks about Islam. And we may give, like, for example, in Erdogan in Turkey, and people will give their support to such a regime and support to such a system. And what you have again is the replication of failure and more years and decades of misery for the ummah. So if we as Muslim women and Muslim men, we want to create change, we need to be clear about what exactly are the structures and the principles and the laws and the institutions of the true Islamic system of governance, which is the Khilafah system. And we need to study that in clear detail. And inshallah, once we have that knowledge, we need to inshallah carry this dawah as Muslim women, and we understand that our role is as important as men in carrying this dawah to our families, to our communities, to our societies, inshallah, challenging the non-Islamic ideas which are around us of nationalism, of democracy, of secular liberal values, and inshallah presenting Islam and the Islamic system as a way of life, as the system of Khilafah, as the means to actually establishing a better future for us in terms of our lands. And just to give an example of this, brother, like as Muslim women, we're familiar that Islam led the world in terms of political rights for women, electing the ruler, being able to account the ruler, being part of being a representative of the people, elected representative of the people. We know that Islam led the world in terms of the economic rights that women have, in terms of inheritance, in terms of being, owning property, all of these issues, and educational rights. We talk about this all the time, right? We know that Islam prohibits even a word of slander against the woman. Forget harassment, but even a word of slander against the reputation of a woman, Islam prohibits this. And we talk about this all the time. But the thing is, we don't see this, right? We don't see this in terms of our lands. So what we need to understand is create a discussion is how do you practically bring those goals and aims that Islam has to real life? And you cannot bring those things to real life. The political rights that women have in Islam, the educational rights, you mentioned Afghanistan, illiteracy, which is rife, right, within these countries. You can't bring these kind of things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has guaranteed, has said these are the rights for women, without having a state which actually values those rights and that vision for women. And that is only the Islamic leadership and the Khilafah. So when you say what as Muslim women can we do? Number one, gain the knowledge of what kind of system can actually create a better leadership for us. What is the system of Islam? What are its structures and so on? Secondly, carry the dawah, inshallah. Do not be silent. Do not think that your role is secondary to that of your brothers and your husbands and your sons. Understand that you have a vital role to change society, just as the West understand that you have a vital role to kind of secularize nations. We need to understand we have a vital role to bring Islam back. Follow the sunnah, follow the pathway of the women of the past who were part of this dawah to create the first Islamic system as well. You know, inshallah, follow their footsteps, and inshallah be part of this great change, but change which will actually, you know, create a radical change for this ummah.
Let me ask you something. Do you think that we as a community, as Muslims, you know, for instance, if you look at the men, fine, they go to Salatul Jum'ah. I think even unfortunately, the masajid probably have more programs for for brothers, more networking. Ulama, even when they come to the masajid, it's majority men who attend the masajid. You know, do you, at least here in the US, I don't know how it is in the UK, but do you think that we as a community really do the work that is needed to educate our sisters? I mean, what would be your advice, if or a nasiha, whatever, that you want to give to the leadership of the Muslims, at least even the masajid, because it's gonna have to come also from the grassroots. You can't get any more grassroots than sisters.
Yeah, so alhamdulillah, brother, there's a lot of good work going on in the community. Alhamdulillah, brothers supporting Islamic circles for the sisters and so on. Much good work. But the thing is,
in UK,
there absolutely has to be the UK, I think in other countries as well. MashaAllah, you have many sisters involved in demonstrations, in conferences. We ourselves have organized international conferences from Indonesia to Tunisia, many different lands. There are activities going on all the time. Hizb ut-Tahrir, sisters, alhamdulillah, have done in demonstrations and protests and, you know, as delegates to particular embassies. So this is going on. But absolutely, there has to be a realization that the woman is the mother, right, of the family. So if she is not educated in Islam effectively, then you will lose a whole generation of, you know, your children, basically.
Yes, yeah,
they will go astray.
We are seeing,
right? So absolutely, there needs to be a focus and the opening of doors, inshallah, by those who have influence in communities to basically provide the education to girls, the Islamic education to girls and to women that is required. Yeah, and it's not just the Islamic education, even the general, like you mentioned in terms of Afghanistan, that Islam, we know, has a legacy of thousands of female scholars underneath Islamic rule, isn't it? Thousands of female scholars. The first university in the world was built by a woman, you know, Fatima al-Fihri. That's the legacy that Islam left the world. So this idea that, you know, girls should, for whatever reason, should not receive the proper education, Islamic or otherwise, it's something which is not from Islam.
Why do you think that is, sister? I know I'm picking on you here because, but you are a sister, but it's so frustrating, sister. When I was in Afghanistan, and if you have 11, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds for the last year have not been in school, many of the parents are putting them back, they're a year behind, so that they at least can go to school again, because the girls are asking, why can't I go to school? Mm-hmm. If you are rich, if you have some type of connections overseas, then people are taking their kids either to Pakistan or to UK or to whatever, they're taking them. But I will tell you, 70 to 80, if not 95, maybe 98% of the people don't have that kind of money to take their kids, 5, 6 kids, and just get up and go move to Pakistan. And Pakistan is not providing visas either, because there's no recognition of a state. Who do you give visa to? That's the whole thing that's going on. I mean, it's a story by itself how I got visas. But what do you tell girls in this situation? People who are claiming that it is Islamic, yani Imara, let's say in this case. I mean, you understand my frustration that, okay, you are claiming to be Islam and then you are removing, just disconnecting people from education completely. Why is that gap there, sister? And why is it always upon the sisters?
So first of all, brother, I think it's a very dangerous situation because what you have is girls starting to resent what they think is Islam.
Jazakallah khair.
You know, starting to resent and feeling that they're being oppressed because, you know, as girls, they have ambitions, you know, they want to gain
Barakallah
knowledge,
feek,
they want to study, and then they are prevented from doing that, and it creates resentment and sometimes hatred towards Islam. And they blame Islam, therefore, for depriving them of the rights that, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given every human being, which is to gain an education, right? To study. So in terms of why is that happening, and we know, like, for example, in Afghanistan, there were many reasons why parents were reluctant during the war to send their, you know, girls to school, whether it was to do with security and safety, lawlessness within the society, all of these kind of issues. But the thing is now, in terms of the Taliban being there, there has to be, like the very second question that we addressed, there has to be a clear vision of what kind of state do you want to be built based upon Islam, right? And you cannot build a clear vision based upon Islam by leaving behind one half of the population, right? You need to understand what kind of state did the Prophet ﷺ build. And we know very clearly that he himself taught the women what they needed to know about Islam, isn't it? He set aside a day to teach them about their deen. And we know underneath the state of the Prophet ﷺ that women, for example, were nurses who used to treat the people who fought jihad. We know of Aisha radiallahu anha, who was an expert in medicine and in grammar and in many things, right? And she was someone that the Sahaba used to go to in order to gain knowledge. We have examples of his time of great scholars and so on. So if we really want an Islamic vision for our lands, we need to understand what kind of state did the Prophet ﷺ build, because that is the model for us in terms of how the future of our land should be in terms of Islamic leadership. Why is it happening? You know, there are traditions, non-Islamic traditions, which still are clouding people's understanding, you know, of what the position of women should be within society. And just to make my final point here, brother, like, this is you know, Islam has such a unique approach to the relationship between men and women in society, as opposed to the West, as opposed to the East and tradition. Islam's view of the relationship between men and women is that you create cooperation between men and women. And Islamic social laws are there, the hijab and the, you know, separation of men and women, are not there to hinder that cooperation, but are there to actually create that cooperation. That's what the Islamic social system is all about. And this comes back to one of the other questions. I think there's a lack of understanding of what the Islamic social system rules are there to achieve. It's not there to isolate women and girls to their homes. It's there to create a society where you have full cooperation between men and women in politics, in education, in economics, but in a manner that protects their dignity, in a manner that protects the family unit, in a manner that protects marriage, but essentially helps the progress of society. And this is, again, one of the debates that we need to create, inshallah. What's the hijab all about? You know, coming back to the title, what are the Islamic social laws all about? What are they trying to create? They're trying to create a society where women are isolated, or a society where men and women cooperate to create a really productive and progressive society where men and women alike, you know, their skills and their minds are harnessed, create a leading state in the world. There's a kind of discussion that we need to have, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. We have 1 minute. Sheikh, a question for you here. You are seeing, let's say, I mean, with Iran, although I have a lot more questions to you regarding Afghanistan than even Iran, just because it's in my head, and I'm seeing a lot of similarities, Sheikh. But let's say if you were to advise to the people in this area, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's, you know, because obviously there's a huge brain drain and there's a lot going on in the area. But if you were to give advice, what steps would you say should be taken by at least new leadership in the area to look at what's happening in Iran, look at what's happening in Pakistan, two huge, subhanallah, almost, for me, I'm looking at it almost an instant superpower. If these three were to come together, they are bordering each other. What strategy would you play out? And I know this is a book, but in one in 1 minute strategy, what are you looking at, Sheikh? I mean, literally in my head, there are borders on both sides, and I'm looking at it, and I'm actually just, because I saw all these areas, and I'm saying, subhanallah, literally instant superpower. But what is your strategy on that? If you were to ask, you were asked a question like this in a conference, and you had elites sitting in front of you.
The individual states we have in this region, Central Asia, in the Persian area, in South Asia, that wasn't the case over 100 years ago. India, as we know, didn't exist. The Iranian border, the Afghan border didn't exist. And that's why these were very important regions. These borders were drawn to make sure these people can't marshal their resources and they can't work together. And it was done for a reason. Primarily, these borders were all drawn by Britain anyway. They were drawn by Britain to make sure that you can't use your human capital and you can't marshal the resources that you have in the region. So really, the only salvation and the solution to most of the problems we face is you reunify, and therefore you utilize the resources you have for the people. That obviously is the worst nightmare for them. And that's why they began the West by creating nation states. They created Iran, they created Afghanistan, they created Pakistan, all these countries. And they're there for a reason. They're there to keep you divided. Unfortunately, many people in this country still view the world through these lenses. But I would say to the people of Pakistan, to the Iranian people, to all the people of the region, these nation states, what have you ever got out of them? They just serve a few people, the elites, and they serve the West. Your salvation, your future is with the people of the region. You believe in the same deen, you believe in the same prophet, you believe that your deen came for the whole world, and by unifying, that's your future. And that's why they're doing everything they can, the West, to make sure you don't unify. They raise all these issues, the hijab, they raise sectarianism, they raise all these issues of how different you are. But these differences we have, I mean, these nationalities that some people are falling back on, most of these are less than 100 years old. These are artificial constructs. So really, the resources are there, the population size is there, the human capital is there. Really, the only thing remaining is political unity. So the obstacle to that is the rulers and the current architecture that we have, and that can be easily removed. In fact, that architecture is already struggling, as we're seeing in Pakistan, as we're seeing in Iran.
And sister, if you were to give advice to the sisters in Iran, what would your advice be? At this point, while things are still hot, there's strikes going on right now in Iran. Who knows? We may be seeing as maybe Persian Spring. Who knows? There's a lot going on that could take the whole area into a whole different, a complete different situation. What would be your advice?
I would say, first of all, brother, that if the sisters really want to liberate themselves, the first path to liberating yourself is liberating yourself from viewing life the way that others want you to view life. If you understand the point that I'm saying, which is that the West for so long has made Muslim women try to make us think in a particular way, which is through their lens about what oppresses them and about what will liberate them. So I would say to my sisters in Iran that, look, if you want a really independent future, first of all, liberate yourself from these claims that have been propagated for so long that Islam oppresses the woman, because this is something that has been engineered in order to continue subjugation, is not something that has been made in order to liberate you. The second thing I would say to my sisters is that just look around the world, just look around the different systems of the world and look at what has happened, what kind of systems are there, and have they succeeded? And inshallah, I would try and discuss with them that, look, any man-made system, it is bound to fail. It is bound to disappoint. It is bound to cause economic crises and social crises and end up with violence against women and all the social problems that we see in states across the world. And the final thing I would try to have a discussion with them is that, we're Muslims. You know, we love Allah, we love our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We know Allah is the only one who can establish a system that is fair for all, that is just, that is prosperous, that will achieve progress. And it's that system that we need to study, inshallah. And we need to throw away all the kind of garbage that has been thrown at Islam for so long and really look at it with, you know, objective eyes, and inshallah study the Islamic system, study the Khilafah, and understand why we say, as thousands of women across the world today are saying, that this is the only system that can truly liberate women from oppression. Inshallah, let's have that debate away from all this, you know, the nonsense and the colonial kind of nonsense that has been thrown against Islam and women for so long.
Jazakumullahu khairan. Inshallah, with those words, first of all, barakallahu fikum, jazakumullahu khairan for both of you. Wallah, it was it's a liberating discussion with those words, that we need to liberate our minds. And to the brothers and sisters who are watching, I'm sure you heard both the brother and the sister. We need to liberate our minds from these colonial systems, from imperialism, from all of these isms that exist, and look at Islam the way it is. And as the sister said, man-made solutions are bound to fail us again and again and again. So it's time, brothers and sisters, especially throughout the whole Muslim world. I mean, I know there was a call for even revolts or at least protests in even Egypt just last Friday, I think it was. And one of the things that I heard was a lot of people did not come on the streets because not that they're scared of the regime or that they're worried. They are waiting to say, what will these protests bring? Because of what they went through in the revolution that was happening when Morsi came to power, and all of this happened. Many of families lost their sons to this regime and daughters to this regime, and jailed and killed and imprisoned and tortured. Now, it's not that the people across this whole Muslim region, not that they don't want change, they are looking for serious solution, because they have already done as much as they can that we can ask. It's a responsibility of the Muslim and Islamic movements specifically that they not only they stop bringing a circular solution that we have been in for the last 50 years, but rather present Islam the way it is without compromising. How much more blood, how many more sons and daughters of this ummah have to be imprisoned for you to understand that and not get the solution? Again, jazakumullahu khairan, both to you, Dr. Nazreen, and to Brother Adnan. Inshallah, believe me, we are going to bring you back in many of the topics that need to be even discussed in this discussion. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. We'll see you guys next Friday, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
لا لن يطول الظلام ديننا لن يضام نحن جيل الهمام نحن فينا عمر لا 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 لن يطول الظلام ديننا لن يضام نحن جيل الهمام نحن فينا عمر صبح بدا نور ظهر نجم وشمس وقمر ألقى على الدنيا الدرر هذا عمر هذا عمر كل البرايا تنتظر أيامه البيض الغرر كي تستفيد من العبر هذا عمر هذا عمر لا لن تدوم الجراح بل سيأتي الصباح نحن أهل الكفاح نحن فينا عمر لا لا لن تدوم الجراح بل سيأتي الصباح نحن أهل الكفاح